The morning I rode into Redstone Creek, my horse was limping, and my pride wasn't doing much better. I'd been on the trail for 11 days straight. My canteen had run dry somewhere past the second ridge, and the biscuits I'd packed had turned green around day 7. I'd eaten them anyway. You do what you have to do. The town came up on me slow, the way all these high desert towns do. First a water tower, then a weather vane, then the smell of smoke and horses and bread baking somewhere behind a closed door. Redstone Creek wasn't much, maybe 60 people, if you counted the children and the old men who sat outside the feed store all day watching nothing happen. I dismounted at the trough near the livery stable and let my horse, Comet, drink long and slow. I pressed my hand against his left flank and felt him tremble just slightly. He was tired. We both were. "You're not from here." I turned around. She was standing maybe 10 feet away, arms crossed, with a basket of dried sage on her hip and a look on her face that said she'd already decided something about me before I opened my mouth. Dark hair, pulled back but falling loose in places. Eyes that were almost amber in that morning light. The kind of color that doesn't have a clean name, somewhere between brown and gold and something older than both. She wore a plain cotton dress, deep blue, and her boots were worn in the way only real work wears boots. I pulled off my hat. "No, ma'am. Passing through." "Passing through to where?" "North. Maybe Wyoming." "Maybe." She said the word like it had a taste she wasn't sure about. "I'm Callum Hayes." I held out my hand. She looked at it for a long second. Then she shook it. Her grip was firm, no nonsense. "Nara," she said. "Nothing else. Just Nara." She turned and walked away before I could say another word. I watched her go, and I don't know why, but something in my chest did a thing I hadn't felt in years. Like a door opening in a house you'd thought was empty. I ended up staying 3 days. That's what I told myself on day 1. 3 days to rest Comet's leg, pick up supplies, maybe get one night in a real bed. The woman at the boarding house, a round, cheerful widow named Mrs. Clary, charged me 40 cents a night and made eggs that could have saved a dying man. On the second morning, I was sitting on the porch eating those eggs when I saw Nara again. She was crossing the main road with 2 children, a boy of maybe 7 and a girl closer to 5, and they were both talking at once, pulling at her hands, pointing at things. She listened to both of them at the same time, which seemed impossible. She answered the boy first, then the girl, then picked up the girl and put her on her hip and said something that made them both laugh. I found myself wondering about her. You notice things on the road that you don't notice when you have a home. You watch people differently. I'd been riding alone for going on 2 years, ever since my brother's ranch went under and I sold what was left and left Texas behind. 2 years of campfires and strangers and no one waiting on the other end of anything. You get a particular kind of lonely doing that. Not the sharp kind that hurts, the dull kind, the kind that's just always there under everything, like a low note you can't unhear. I asked Mrs. Clary that evening, as casual as I could, who Nara was. She set her coffee down. "You met Nara, briefly, near the livery stable." Mrs. Clary gave me a look that I couldn't quite read. Her full name is Nara Swiftcloud, half Apache, half Mexican. Her mother's people were from the San Carlos territory. She came here about 4 years ago. She paused. "Her husband died." "I'm sorry." "She doesn't need your sorry. She built half that garden out back on her own. She trades medicinal herbs with the doctor, and she keeps those 2 children fed on not much more than good sense and hard work." Mrs. Clary picked her coffee back up. "She doesn't trust men easily. I'll say that much. I wasn't asking because I know why people ask, Mr. Hayes." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that said she'd been watching fools trip over their own intentions for 30 years. "The question is whether you know." I didn't have an answer for that. I just sat with my coffee and the last of the light and wondered why I wasn't thinking about Wyoming anymore. I met her properly on the 3rd day. There was a commotion near the general store just after noon, the kind that starts quiet and gets loud fast. I heard voices and came around the corner and found two men, ranch hands by the look of them, dusty, annoyed, standing over Nara's boy. The little boy had knocked over a crate of something by accident, probably apples from the look of the mess on the ground. And one of the men had him by the collar of his shirt. Now, let me tell you something. I am not a violent man by nature. I've gone out of my way for most of my life to avoid trouble. But there is something about a grown man putting his hands on a child who weighs less than a feed bag, that turns off whatever reasonable part of your brain usually handles the talking. I stepped between them before I thought it through. "Let him go," I said. The man who was holding the boy looked up at me. He was big, wider across the shoulder than me, with a face like he'd been in a few arguments with walls. "This ain't your business, stranger. He knocked over your apples. He's 7 years old." I kept my voice level. "I'll pay for the apples. Let him go." There was a second, just one, where it could have gone either way. Then the man dropped the boy. The boy stumbled back and ran, and I heard him call out, "Mama!" And then Nara was there, pulling him against her side, checking his face with both hands, her jaw tight. The ranch hand looked at me for another moment. Then he spat on the ground and walked off, the other man following. I turned to Nara. "He all right?" She was still looking at her boy, running her thumb along his cheek. Then she looked up at me, that amber gaze steady and measuring. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. It wasn't anything. It was something." She said it quietly, and I believed her. The boy looked up at me from under his mother's arm. He had her eyes. "You talk funny," he said. "Miguel," her voice was a warning. "He does," Miguel said, unrepentant. I laughed, and after a moment so did she. It was the first time I'd seen her smile, and it rearranged something in me I couldn't put back where it was. I stayed another week. I told myself it was because of Comet's leg, which was still a little tender. That was partially true. But when I'm being honest, and I'm trying to be honest here, that's the whole point of telling this. I stayed because of her. We didn't talk every day. That's not how it worked. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed filling every silence with words. But I'd see her in the mornings when I walked to get coffee, and sometimes she'd nod, and sometimes she'd say something brief and dry that made me smile the whole way to the end of the block. I learned things slowly, the way you learn anything worth knowing. I learned that the little girl's name was Rosa, and she was terrified of chickens, but fascinated by snakes, which her mother thought was backwards. I learned that Nara made her own dye from plants she grew and traded in the colors for cloth from a woman in Tucson. I learned that she'd been born in the territory, that her mother had taught her to read in 3 languages, and that her husband, a quiet man from Sonora named Ernesto, had died of a fever going on 3 years ago now. She didn't talk about him often. When she did, it wasn't with grief exactly. More like a kind of careful respect, the way you'd speak about someone who deserved the truth, said plainly. What I noticed, though, was how alone she was. Not without people. The town knew her, the doctor respected her. Mrs. Clary was fond of her in her own sharp way. But there's a particular aloneness that comes after losing someone. And it's different from just being by yourself. It's the aloneness of having had something real and then not having it anymore. Of still being 2 people in your own mind when the world has decided you're only one. I knew that aloneness. I'd been carrying a quieter version of it since my own life came undone in Texas. One evening toward the end of my 2nd week, I'd stopped counting the days the same way, had stopped thinking about Wyoming in any concrete sense. I found her sitting behind her house in the last of the light. She was repairing something, a length of leather harness by the look of it, her fingers moving fast and sure. I stopped at the fence. "Can I sit for a minute?" She looked up, considered. Then she nodded at the ground beside the step, and I sat. We were quiet for a while. The kind of quiet that's comfortable instead of strained. The kind you have to earn. "You've been here 2 weeks," she said eventually. Without accusation, just observing. Comet's leg, She didn't say it was a lie. She didn't say it wasn't. Where are you actually going, Callum Hayes? I thought about that. Somewhere that feels like somewhere, I said finally. She looked at me then, and I felt, seen in a way that made my throat do something inconvenient. That's not a place, she said. That's a feeling. Yes, I said. I know. She went back to the harness. The needle moved in and out of the leather in even stitches. The light went orange, and then pink, and then the first stars came up. My mother used to say, she said, after a while, that a man who doesn't know where he's going will either stop somewhere good or somewhere bad, and the difference is mostly what he's paying attention to. I let that sit. I've been paying attention, I said. She glanced at me sideways, the ghost of something in her expression. Not quite a smile, not quite not. I noticed, she said. There's a moment in any honest story where you have to stop dressing up the plain thing and just say it. I had fallen for her. Completely. Without ceremony or permission or any of the logical steps a sensible man would take. Somewhere between the water trough on day one and that evening on the step, she had gotten into the part of me I'd kept locked since Texas, and she'd done it just by being entirely, uncomplicatedly herself. But I knew the ground here was not easy. She was a widow with 2 small children. She was Apache and Mexican in a town that was mostly white and mostly uncomfortable with both. She had built her life from scratch in a place that hadn't exactly rolled out a welcome for her, and she had done it with her own hands and her own stubbornness. And she did not owe me or anyone else a single thing. And I was a man with no fixed address and a lame horse and a general direction that had already proven to be mostly an excuse. I wrestled with this for 3 more days. I thought about leaving. I thought about just pointing Comet north and letting the distance take care of things the way distance usually does. It would be cleaner, easier, less risk of making a mess of something that was working fine without me. But I kept thinking about the way she'd smiled at her boy, and the way she held her daughter's hand crossing the street, and the way she'd looked at me that evening in the last of the light, like I was something she was still making up her mind about, but hadn't dismissed yet. And I thought about my mother, who used to say that the brave thing and the right thing had a habit of being the same thing if you waited long enough to see clearly. I waited 1 more day. Then I went to her. She was in her garden when I found her, on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from between rows of something low and green I didn't know the name of. Rosa was sitting 3 feet away, playing with 2 smooth stones, narrating something under her breath. Miguel was not in evidence. I came around the side gate and she looked up. I need to say something, I said, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything back. She sat back on her heels, brushed the dirt from her hands onto her apron. Her expression was careful. I took my hat off, turned it in my hands. I came here for 3 days, I said, and I've been here going on 3 weeks now. And I've told myself about 6 different stories about why that is. But the real reason is you. That's the plain truth of it, and I'm not going to wrap it up any more than that. She was very still. I know what your life is, I said. I know you didn't ask for a man showing up and getting opinions about things. I know you've built something here, and you don't need anyone to build it for you. I'm not saying I want to walk in and take over. I'm saying I stopped, tried to find the right words. I'm saying that 2 weeks ago, I was riding somewhere that had no actual name, and I didn't feel anything in particular about that. And now the idea of getting back on that road, I stopped again. It costs me something. It costs me more than it should if you were just a town I passed through. Rosa looked up from her stones at me with frank curiosity. Nara was watching me with that level gaze I'd come to understand, meant she was thinking hard. I'm not a perfect man, I said. I don't have a property. I have some money saved, but not so much that it counts as a plan. I'm 34 years old, and I've been moving for 2 years because I didn't know how to stop. I looked at her. I think maybe I know how to stop now. I just needed to find a reason that was real. The silence stretched. Rosa went back to her stones and her narration. Nara stood up slowly. She was about 5.5 feet tall, but she had a way of standing that made the space around her feel bigger, like she was taking up exactly as much room as she was entitled to. "That is a very long thing to say," she said. "I know. What is it that you actually want, Callum Hayes?" And here is where I said it. The thing I had not planned to say, the thing that came out before the careful version of me could get in front of it. "I want a life with you," I said. "I want to stay. I want to know your children, and I want to build something here." And I stopped. And then, God help me, the next thing came out. "I want a child with you someday. If you'd ever." She stared at me. I heard myself and felt the full weight of what I'd just said, and the blood went to my face in a way I had not experienced since I was about 16 years old. I started. "Honest," she said quietly, not shocked, not offended, just quiet. "Too honest," I said. "Probably." I apologize for the last part. "Don't." She looked at me for a long moment. There was something working behind her eyes that I couldn't read. Then she looked away, down at her garden, and the silence stretched again. "My husband," she said finally, "was a gentleman, a good man. He never once raised his voice to me or the children." She paused. "When he died, I thought that was it. That part of my life was done. I had the children and the garden and the herbs, and that was enough." She looked back at me. I thought it was enough, the way she said it. That last sentence, something in the tense of it. "Was?" I said. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "I haven't decided yet." I went back to Mrs. Clary's that evening, and I sat on the porch and I didn't know what to do with myself. Part of me felt like a man who jumped off a cliff and was waiting to find out if there was water below. Part of me felt something lighter than I'd felt in 2 years. I hadn't decided yet. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, and it was honest. I respected her too much to push. So I went on living in Redstone Creek the way I'd been living. I started doing odd work for the livery stable, which needed extra hands, and I helped Mrs. Clary fix her back fence one afternoon, and I began to learn the names of the people in this small, sun-baked, improbable place. I didn't try to see Nara every day. I didn't arrange reasons to walk past her house. I let things move at whatever pace they were going to move, and I tried not to want anything too loudly. But Miguel found me, because children who like you have no patience for adult nonsense. He turned up at the livery stable 4 days after my conversation with his mother and announced that he wanted to learn to ride properly. He had big feet for a 7-year-old and absolutely no fear, which is both the most useful and the most dangerous combination in a child. I taught him to sit a horse, how to breathe, how to hold the reins loose, not tight. Tight tells the horse you're scared, I told him, and the horse will believe you. Miguel absorbed this with the absolute seriousness of a small person who has decided something is important. Rosa came the 3rd day and announced she wanted to learn too. I looked at her. She was 5 years old and not much bigger than a good-sized dog, and she had the same amber eyes as her mother, set in a round face that was currently arranged into an expression of absolute determination. "Can you ride?" she asked me. "Yes, good," she said. "Teach me." I taught her on the oldest, most patient horse in the stable, a spotted mare named Dulce, who I was fairly certain had seen everything this world had to offer and felt no strong feelings about any of it. Rosa sat up straight as a pin and held the reins exactly as I showed her, and said nothing for the entire first lesson except again. I was, in ways I couldn't fully explain, completely undone by these children. Nara came to find me on a Thursday. It was early morning, before most people were up. I was out back of the stable, mending a saddle in the good light, when I heard her step and looked up. She was wearing her hair down. That was the first thing I noticed. I'd only seen it loose once before, that very first morning, and since then it had always been pinned up or braided. It fell past her shoulders, dark and heavy, and she had one of her herb baskets on her arm and she stood there in the early light like she was also part of the landscape of this place. La, and the dust and the sage. "I've been thinking," she said. "All right." She came closer and sat on the top rail of the fence without any particular self-consciousness. She looked at me for a moment and then looked at the horizon. "I was 17 when I married Ernesto," she said. "I didn't have a lot of say in the shape of my own life then. I went where I was told. I married who made sense. I'm not saying it was bad, it wasn't. He was kind and it was a good life." She paused. "But it was not a life I chose exactly." "I know," I said carefully. "I have chosen this one," she said. "Every piece of it, this house, this garden, this town even, I chose it." She turned and looked at me. "If I were to choose you, it would need to be a choice, not something that just happened to me." "I understand that. Do you?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. The last thing on earth I wanted was to be something that happened to her. She was quiet again, turning something over. "Miguel talks about you constantly," she said. "Rosa tried to show me how to hold reins yesterday in the kitchen using a piece of rope." I felt my mouth move into something helpless. "I know, I probably should have asked you before." "They haven't had a man in their lives who stayed," she said simply. "Their father died. The men here." She didn't finish that. She didn't need to. "I'm staying," I said. "That's not the part I'm uncertain about." "What part are you uncertain about?" "Whether you want me to." She looked at me for a long time. The sun was fully up now, cutting across the yard, and it caught the amber in her eyes. And she was the most beautiful thing I had ever looked at in my life. And I didn't know what to do with that, except hold it. "I don't fully know you yet," she said. "No, I don't trust easily. I know. And I have 2 children who have already lost one person they loved. I won't let them lose another." Her voice was entirely level, entirely serious. "If you stay all the way. Or you leave now, and I'll shake your hand and hold no hard feelings." "I'll stay all the way," I said. "All the way is the only kind of staying I know how to do." She looked at me, some last calculation happening behind those eyes. Then she nodded slowly, and something in her settled, and something in me settled too, like 2 weights finding their balance. "Then stay," she said. We didn't fall into anything dramatic after that. There was no sweep and no grand gesture. It was slower and more real than that. I moved into a small room above the livery stable, and I worked and I ate supper with Mrs. Clary, and I saw Nara almost every day, and things grew between us the way things grow in the high desert. Not in a rush, not without struggle, but sure. She brought me coffee once, walking past in the morning, and she sat for 10 minutes on the fence while we talked about nothing important. And thought, "This is it. This right here." She let me stay for supper for the first time 6 weeks after I'd arrived. She made something with chilies and beans and dried corn that I'd never had before, and Miguel told me about 6 things he'd learned that week. And Rosa sat next to me and put her small hand on the back of my hand once, mid-meal, for no particular reason, and then took it away and went back to eating. I looked at Nara, and she was watching me with that measuring look and something gentler underneath it. I said nothing. I didn't need to. It was winter by the time she let me close enough to kiss her. Not a harsh winter. This was the territory, not Montana, but cold enough that the mornings cracked your knuckles and the nights came fast. We were standing on her porch after I'd helped split wood for the next week, and the sun was going down behind the red rocks west of town, turning everything the color of fire. She had turned to go inside, and then she stopped, and she turned back, and she looked at me with something open in her face that I hadn't seen before. Not guarded, not measuring, just there. "Callum," she said, that was all. Just my name. But in the way she said it, I heard everything. I stepped forward. She didn't step back. I put my hands on her face very carefully, the way you'd hold something you'd waited a long time for, and I kissed her, and she kissed me back. And it was so quiet and so certain that it felt less like a beginning than like the recognition of something that had been true for a while. When we broke apart, the sky behind her was all that fire and copper. "I was wondering when you'd do that," she said. "I was waiting for you to be ready." "I've been ready for about 2 months," she said. I laughed. I couldn't help it. She smiled, the full smile I'd been collecting like something rare, and I pulled her close. And she let me, her head against my shoulder, both of us looking out at those burning rocks like we had all the time in the world. And maybe we did. I proposed on the first day of spring, not on one knee. She would have found that absurd, and she'd have been right. I did it in the morning, in her kitchen, while she was making coffee and Rosa was still asleep, and Miguel was outside arguing with a fence post about something. I said, "I'd like to marry you, if you're willing." She kept pouring the coffee. "I've been thinking about it too," she said. And she handed me my cup. She looked at me across the small table in the early light with that level amber gaze. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." We were married in April on a Wednesday morning with about 30 people watching, and the red rocks lit up behind everything, and Rosa in a yellow dress she'd picked herself, and Miguel standing beside me with the borrowed solemnity of someone trying very hard to be the man of the family and not quite ready to give that up, and also not quite able to stop grinning. Nara wore her hair down. When the preacher said his words and I said mine, and she said hers, her voice was clear and steady and sure, the way she was about everything that mattered. I put the ring on her hand and she looked at it, and then she looked at me, and in her eyes was the last thing I expected. Not pride, not triumph, but relief. The same relief I felt. The particular relief of arriving somewhere real after traveling too long in no particular direction. I kissed my wife in April sun in front of 30 people I now knew by name, and Miguel cheered. And Rosa hid her face in her hands and then looked through her fingers to see what happened. And Mrs. Clary made the sound women make when they've been right about something for months and can finally say so. I want to tell you what life looks like now, so you know how these things end when they end right. It looks like 4 people at a table every morning. It looks like Comet healed and strong and ridden by an 8-year-old boy with no fear. It looks like Rosa teaching me about plants. Because it turns out she knows more about what grows in this desert than I ever will, and she's 6 years old, and that's just the plain truth. It looks like Nara in the early morning, before the children are up, sitting with her coffee on the step, her hair loose, watching the light come up over the red rock, and me sitting down beside her. And both of us saying nothing, because nothing needs to be said. I came to Redstone Creek in August, looking for nothing in particular, headed somewhere that didn't have a real name. I found a woman who knew who she was, who had built her life with her hands and her stubbornness and her 2 remarkable children, who didn't need saving, didn't need completing, didn't need anything from me except, eventually, honesty and steadiness and the willingness to stay. The world told her plenty of things about herself. It told her she was half of this and half of that, and not enough of any one thing. It made her small in 100 ways when it had the chance. She answered all of that by being more herself. More fully, more quietly, more unbudgeably herself than anyone I've ever known. I told her once, late at night with the fire low, that she was the bravest person I'd ever met. She thought about it for a moment. "No," she said, "I was just too tired to be afraid." I didn't argue, but I knew what I knew. There is a child now, born in February, in the same room where Rosa had been born, with Mrs. Clary helping and Miguel pacing outside the door wearing a groove in the floorboards. We named her Elena. She has Nara's eyes, that amber, that old gold light. She has, for reasons no one can explain, my nose, which I've always considered a mediocre inheritance at best. The first time I held her, she was about 4 hours old and small in a way that made the world feel very large and serious and worth treating with care. I looked at her small face, and I thought about all the roads I'd ridden and all the nights I'd slept under nothing but open sky, and all the ways I'd told myself that moving was the same as living. And I thought, Here is what I was moving toward. I just didn't know it yet. Nara was watching me from the bed, tired in the way that goes all the way down to the bone. "You're going to cry," she said. "I'm not going to cry," I said. "I was absolutely going to cry." She smiled. The full smile. The one I still collect like something rare, even after all this time. "Come here," she said. I sat beside her on the bed, Elena in my arms, Nara's head against my shoulder, and outside the window Redstone Creek was doing exactly what it always did. Getting on with itself in the sun, quiet and dry and permanent as the red rock. I pressed my lips to the top of my wife's head. She leaned into me and closed her eyes. And I sat there in the warm room with my daughter and my wife. And I didn't want anything more than what I had, which is, I've come to understand, the whole point.